On March 15th, the Spanish government ordered a strict lockdown of the entire country. No one was allowed to go outside, even to go for a walk around the block. Police set up checkpoints, and passing patrols stopped anyone found outside. Over 1 million people were fined, and thousands were arrested. So like everybody else, I sat on my couch, eating, drinking, and plotting what I'd do when the lockdown ended. On July 1st, Spain finally reopened their borders, and I set off for Paris, by bike. But I was in terrible shape. Months of sitting on the couch hadn't done wonders for my fitness, and I wasn't sure I'd even make it over the Pyrenees, let alone all the way to Paris. I had no idea what traveling across Europe in the middle of a pandemic would be like. But after the last couple of months, I knew it was time to leave Spain. So I stuffed my bags with hand sanitizer and face masks, and I headed out of town. Whatever else Spain is, it is stunningly beautiful. Heading out of Barcelona along the coast road, the city sprawls. But after 50 miles, the suburbs stop and the Pyrenees start to drop into the sea. It looks like something out of a James Bond film. The part at the end where he escapes to the beach with some beautiful woman. One of my favorite cycling roads in the world is just north of Tossa del Mar. It hugs the coast along this winding path overlooking cliffs that plunge into the sea. The road goes on like this for 40 miles, up a reasonable grade, and then back down to the sea. There's almost zero car traffic up here, and this time there weren't even any other cyclists. I had it all to myself. A bit further north, the road flattens, and you end up in a string of mass-market tourist towns. It's not the most picturesque stretch, but there's an abundance of cheap hotels, bars, and restaurants. I've been through a lot of these towns before, and it's sad to see them so empty. A lot of the shops were closed and shuttered. Usually these towns are overflowing with Germans or the English, but now they're ghost towns. There's nobody here except for a few Spanish who run the shops or sit bored at the front desks of empty hotels. Once I left the coast, my route became very rural, and I traveled on country roads and a few off-road trails that wind through the hills. Every so often I rolled into small towns to fill up my water bottles and get some food. I was worried that these towns would be completely closed, but it was never a struggle to find someplace open. As I got close to the Pyrenees, I wound my way through a small town, and I was surprised to find a castle in the center that somebody had turned into a casino. After having my temperature taken and my contact details written down, I was allowed to go inside in bike shorts, just so long as I left my camera with security. Crossing the Pyrenees this morning into France. It's kind of cool. Kind of hungover from playing around at a casino all night, which might not have been the best choice, but here we are. Crossing the Pyrenees wasn't as bad as I'd expected, and the way down from the pass to the sea was a lot of fun. I'd expected the French side of the border to be more or less identical to the Spanish side, but just a couple of miles into France, everything was completely different. Nobody spoke Spanish, even here on the border. It was hotter on this side as well, and while I'd heard of the Mistral winds, I wasn't prepared for just how strong and constant and directly in my face they were going to be. After leaving the area right on the border, the scenery left a lot to be desired, and it started to look more like Orlando than a postcard of the French Riviera. This field for, 10, 15 miles, direct sun. Wind is just non-stop, 37 miles an hour. Eventually, though, I got to a towpath along the Canal de Midi, which had seemed like a good idea when I was sitting on my couch looking at maps. but it turned out to be 150 unpaved miles heading directly into a headwind. The wind howled down the canal, and there wasn't much shade. I'd tried some alternate routes, but the roads were narrow, and they were packed with these tiny French clown cars being driven at top speeds. In the end, I stuck with the canal. The further I got, the stronger I began to feel, and the scenery started to improve. For a while, I forgot that there was anything going on in the world at all, and it was just me riding a bike alone in the middle of nowhere. Pulling into the huge fortified town of Carcassonne was like pulling into an abandoned Disney World. The parking lot for tour buses outside the city walls were empty, and after riding across a drawbridge into the center of town, I found that the narrow city streets were virtually deserted as well. The next day, the town did get some day trippers, and it became evident just how much more relaxed the French were about the coronavirus than the Spanish. Masks were rarely worn, people ate inside restaurants, and nobody made much of an effort to keep a distance from me. The Spanish side had felt a bit like an Ebola hospital, but the French side just kind of felt like France. The farther north I made it into France, the nicer the cycling infrastructure became, and by the time I made it into La Rochelle, I finally felt like I was in the France in the movies. Between the coast and the Loire Valley, I rode through endless fields of sunflowers and small towns untouched by tourism. It looked like something out of a World War II film, but the part before the Germans got there. I hadn't seen any other bicycle tourists until now, but all of a sudden they were everywhere. The Loire Valley turned out to be a huge destination for families taking bike holidays, and it's easy to see why. The area is known as the Valley of the Kings, and it's dotted with huge mansions. They became so common that after a while, I didn't even bother to stop when I rode past one, and they would just blend into the scenery.
Not pretty good.
Here there were decently large towns every 50 to 60 miles, and it was nice to stop into places like Tours and Orleans and end my day in a semi-urban environment. Here too, life seemed to go on as usual, and the bars and restaurants were all packed. The Loire Valley was a highlight of the journey, and I became accustomed to perfectly paved, car-free bike highways, and I started to dread the last day of my trip. The only route I could find from Orleans into Paris was a 70-mile sprint along heavily trafficked roads through suburban sprawl. In the end, I took the soft option and just hopped onto a train. I'm usually not a fan of Paris. It's crowded and expensive, and the center is packed with tourists. But this time, it's just me and the few French who haven't already fled the city for the summer holidays. And to be the only tourist in Paris is to live in the Paris of the movies. There's no lines at the Louvre, no crowds in front of what's left of Notre Dame. The scammers left with the tourists, and nobody bothers me when I sit along the banks of the Seine. It's the way I've always imagined the city. As an American, I'm lucky to be stuck on this side of the EU travel ban. For the most part, I can go wherever I want, which is a luxury I took for granted just 5 months ago. So I guess for those of you who can't come, know it's all still here, and for the most part, it looks just like it did in 2019. There's just a lot fewer people and a lot more hand sanitizer.